I am muted. Classic. Hope everyone's doing lovely tonight. Thanks for joining for anyone who's coming to hang out. Tonight, I'm actually super excited to chat about this breakthrough that happened back in December, I believe, and it made a little bit of news, but been doing a little bit more reading on it, and just like the implications of it are incredibly exciting. And it also gives a cool opportunity to kind of discuss what the current state of AI is and how it's being used. I have a couple of neat videos I think we'll rip through pretty quickly. We'll talk about protein folding, what the problem is, how AlphaFold contributed to the solving of that problem, and what sort of the implications of that are. Excuse me, I gotta wet my whistle here. So the first thing to put this conversation in context is like, what are proteins? What role do they play in biology? And how are they created? So essentially, proteins are strings of amino acids that, as they sort of come out of the cell, I think they're produced like the ribosome. They go through a process of actually twirling and folding. And I'll have some pictures here to kind of illustrate this. And what you sort of start with is a string of amino acids. And through a process that we don't fully understand in any capacity, that amino acid string folds into a protein. So proteins are sort of the fundamental building block of most biological life. They're kind of the doers of everything. They're the machines. They're sort of like the building blocks, like you hear all about, like, oh, you got to get your protein if you're, like if you're ripping and, bodybuilding. That's where you need your fibrous proteins. That's things like keratin, collagen, elastin. Then you have things like globular or membrane proteins, which are usually for regulation, transport, and a variety of different other bodily functions. So these things start out as these tiny little, like almost like poo-poo strands, and then again through some process that we don't understand, fold into these 3D structures. And what's really important to note is that the shape or the structure of that particular protein determines its function, which kind of makes sense, right? Depending on the shape of a tool, it's going to determine its function in your garage. It's either going to be like a sharp thing like a saw, or it's going to be a pointy thing like a screwdriver that fits in a particular key, receptors, all that sort of stuff. So proteins, again, fundamental building block of life. We have no idea how they actually form in the body. We have a vague idea of where they start and where they end. And there's actually a funny analog here in terms of how artificial intelligence works, but I'll get to that in a sec. The most important thing to take into consideration is, again, like just the structure and the shape of them determines what their function is and what they're able to do in the human body. Now, how do we see proteins? Like, how can you actually visualize a protein? The most common method is actually something called X-ray crystallography. And the process essentially involves you creating some kind of solution where that protein is hyper concentrated, right? So imagine trying to make a solution where it mostly contains that particular protein. And once you have it in that particular X-ray crystallography, once you have it in that solution, you can use chemical processes to precipitate crystals inside of that fluid. And essentially the proteins get sort of trapped in these crystals. And then what you do is you take those crystals and you put them under X-rays. And based off of the way the X-ray bounces and refracts, you're essentially able to infer the shape of the protein. Super fascinating technology, but there's a couple problems with it. Number one, it's expensive as hell. It costs about $120K to actually do like a full spectroscopy of a protein. And it's also time prohibitive. It actually takes about a year for the whole process to run through the crystallization and all that stuff. So not only is it super expensive, but it's super time consuming. And this is one of the interesting areas where, AI in sort of having its place in human society in the future is going to have a really, really huge part to play. And that's sort of reducing the amount of time it would take us to figure certain things out. And we'll kind of get into how that works later. So again, we use different kinds of spectroscopies to see these proteins, and we can see their structure. But the nature of the experiment eliminates our ability to actually see how the protein is created. We don't have microscopes or optical technology that's capable. Again, we're using crystals and X-rays and all kinds of different methods to somehow bounce electrons or photons off of these things and infer their shape based off of things. Like essentially, you're looking at its shadow and determining what it looks like. Kind of. I'm really reducing it there. So, got these proteins. We can see them in nature by using these incredibly expensive, cost-prohibitive techniques, but we have no idea how they fold, right? And this is where AI comes in, and where particularly AlphaFold comes in. So before we get too deep into the weeds on the specifics of AlphaFold, I just want to touch on a couple of core concepts around AI, right? So when people think AI, this is usually what they think of, right? Yeah, your evil Terminator coming in, right? The concept of Skynet and the evil AI that are here to destroy the world are typically what we refer to as AGI, or artificial general intelligence. AGI would be the kind of AI that's like, hey, my name's Alan. I'm aware of myself. I'm conscious. I can feel. Whether it could be completely disembodied and not really have, arms or legs or whatever, but it could have a sense of self. And that's typically artificial general intelligence. And a lot of people in the AI community essentially agree that that is some ways away. There's a lot of disagreement in how far away. Some people are like, it's 500 years away. And some people are like, no, it's like 50,000 years away. And some people are like, man, it could be 50 years away. There's not very many people in the 50 years category. Let's just put it that way. What we talk about commonly, or what you hear about, is particularly in today's, you hear about AI and machine learning, and we're using this technology. A lot of implementations of artificial intelligence are actually very narrow. The scope of them is not particularly broad. So they're built to do very specific, sort of narrow tasks. Things like image detection, things like AlphaGo. You guys may have heard of this AlphaGo AI that they built by Google. Was essentially for the first time able to absolutely own, decimate the world's champions. Couldn't keep up with how good these AI were. And Go is much more complicated than chess. There's a lot more variables. It's considered a much more complex game. And as a result, it's like, okay, yeah, we get that we programmed AI to beat people in chess. That's cool. But the fact that we're smothering Go players now is pretty impressive. So you can build these AI to do super narrow things like chess, voice detection. That's Siri and Alexa use a lot of AI to process what you're saying and get that back. But we don't have, again, wide scale or wide scoped out AI. And AlphaFold is very similar. It's a purpose-built AI. It's meant to solve a particular problem or try and simulate a particular function in nature. Okay. I want to talk about neural networks really quickly. So for those of you who are not sure what a neural network is, this is a visual abstraction of what it is. So you essentially have a layer of inputs. You have what's called a hidden layer, and then you have your output layer. So in a simple network, you sort of have one layer of abstraction that's happening. And we're kind of going to get into why the layer is hidden. So let's not get too deep in the weeds here. But when we talk about neural networks and deep learning, all you're talking about is adding more layers in between. You're adding more layers or more processes of abstraction, okay? And so the more layers, the more complicated, yada, yada, yada. But essentially, at the end of the day, you have an input, you have an output. You're trying to get your AI to do something like detect the faces, in an image, or a really interesting example of like a new purpose built AI, which could have fascinating implications on something like bandwidth, is, and we're going to show you an example of this shortly. NVIDIA, who's a graphics card company, has built an AI that is capable of essentially, so when we're doing this Twitch session, right, my webcam is essentially being, that's encoding that data, and it is sending it across the internet, and it requires a certain amount of, bandwidth to send all of the signal of my camera. Now, what NVIDIA has been able to do is essentially teach an AI to say, hey, I'm going to send you a fraction of that information, and you're just going to basically deep fake or draw a mark on the other side. So we don't need to send nearly as much detail in our bandwidth. So if you've ever been on like a Zoom call or a call for any conference lately for anything, and you see people's faces cracking up, that could potentially be a thing of the past in a couple of years with this technology, because the amount of information that we need to send in order to create those visual faces and abstractions on the other side will be reduced. And we're not talking like, oh, it's reduced by 10% or 20%. Like, it's reduced by 2/3. You have to send only 1/3 of the data to get what essentially is the same result. Now, of course, there's a creep factor of like, okay, now my computer is drawing me on the other side, and what if something gets glitched on the way, or it changes your face into someone you don't want to be turned into. Yeah, those are problems that have to be solved. But this is what I mean about the fascinating implications of where narrow purpose built AI is particularly cool, and has a lot of there are a lot of implementations of that right now. When we hear about things like machine learning, so a really good way of, so machine learning, a lot of websites that you go to nowadays, you'll notice that they have a little chat box that pops up in the bottom right hand corner. It's like, hey, it's Kyle, how can I help you? Right? There's no Kyle, it's a bot. It's a literal chat bot. And those bots can be really, really good at parsing out like, hey, Kyle, I need to return my order, or I'm pissed about my order, or my order sucks, how do I return it? It's very hard to get an AI back in the day to recognize the differences between those things, but chatbots are really good at doing that. But the way that they're able to do that is by being fed large sets of data. And that's what machine learning is, right? It's basically you give it millions of chats. You're like, here are all of these examples of chats, and here's sort of the outputs of those chats and the conversations. Learn from that. Okay, so you'll hear about things like deep learning, deep reinforcement networks. This is kind of what we're getting into. So really, really interesting abstract concepts in AI. But to get a little bit into deeper into the weeds, into specifically what I want. Oh, sorry, I had a really great little slide that I wanted to show. So this is a great example of the hidden layers and the output layers. Okay, so when we're doing facial recognition, one of the first steps of the layer is to basically look for patterns of local contrast, right? So it does one sweep or one set of processing on the image that helps it eliminate a lot of information that it might not need to look for, or something that it might just specifically need to separate to make it easier to, on the next layer, identify things like facial features, noses, ears, mouths, noses, and then in the next layer actually do face detection, and then on the output layer we're like, oh, this is a face, this is a blah, this is a whatever. So this is what deep networks look like. They have multiple layers of abstraction that are doing specific sort of operations on that set of data to pull out is this a face? Is this an ears? Is this a noses? So a really cool example, and this kind of ties back to what I was saying about the NVIDIA, reducing your bandwidth. It's a great website that you can go to, and it's called thispersondoesnotexist.com. this photo that you're looking at, this person is not a real person. It's not a real photograph. It's not taken anywhere on the planet Earth. It's been generated by an AI in December of 2019. And what's cool is you can kind of just refresh the page and it'll show you another, oh, this person doesn't exist. Not a real human being, right? And you can go through it for, I think, hours. Like, there's so many photographs that it has generated. And these are amazing. Like, when you look at sort of some of the detail, there might be things that you pick up on that you're like, okay, you know, I find the line on the chin is a little fuzzy. Like, maybe that looks a little weird, but like the blemishes and like the lips are real, like just there's certain things you look at and you're like, fuck, that's gotta be a real human being, right? But it's not, right? These pictures are generated by AI. There's another one, I wish, oh, here it is. Yeah, this cat does not exist. So I always find the cat one to be a little bit weirder because I feel like it fucks up more or it's blurrier for some reason. But again, this cat doesn't exist. This cat doesn't exist. These are procedurally generated cats by an artificial intelligence that's been given a set of instructions to build cats. Okay. So there's a really cool video that I want to show you guys. It really sort of helps contextualize how AI works, what the black box problem is, or sort of that hidden layer that I addressed earlier. And I think that's really going to help us inform a little bit more conversation around AlphaFold, what it has been capable of doing in the protein space, some of the next steps, and then, yeah. So let's check out this. This video is by CGP Grey. Cannot recommend their content enough. It's really sick. Let's check it out.
On the internet, the algorithms are all around you. You are watching this video because an algorithm brought it to you, among others, to click, which you did, and the algorithm took note. When you open the tweetbook, the algorithm decides what you see. When you search through your photos, the algorithm does the finding, maybe even makes a little movie for you. When you buy something, the algorithm sets the price, and the algorithm is at your bank watching transactions for fraud. The stock market is full of algorithms trading with algorithms. Given this, you might want to know how these little algorithmic bots shaping your world work, especially when they don't. In ye olden days, humans built algorithmic bots by giving them instructions the humans could explain. If this, then that. But many problems are just too big and hard for a human to write simple instructions for. There's a gazillion financial transactions a second. Which ones are fraudulent? There's octillion videos on NetMeTube. Which 8 should the user see as recommendations? Which shouldn't be allowed on the site at all? For this airline seat, what is the maximum price this user will pay right now? Algorithmic bots give answers to these questions. Not perfect answers, but much better than a human could do. But how these bots work exactly, more and more no one knows. Not even the humans who built them, or built them, as we will see. Now, companies that use these bots.
So, sorry, I just want to pause here. This is a really, really important point. And when I tell people this, when I'm having conversations about artificial intelligence, it blows people's minds a little bit. So I just want to reiterate that, like, we don't know how the AI works. We can train them to do things, we get an output, and we love what it's giving us, but there's no way for us to ask it, well, how did you do that? It's kind of like when you see like a picture. We'll get into the examples. I'm not going to do too the weeds. Sorry, guys.
Bots don't want to talk about how they work because the bots are valuable employees, very, very valuable, and how their brains are built is a fiercely guarded trade secret. Right now, the cutting edge is most likely very I hope you like linear algebra, but what the current hotness is on any particular site and how the bots work is a bit I don't know, and always will be. So let's talk about one of the more quaint but understandable ways bots can be built without understanding how their brains work. Say you want a bot that can recognize what is in a picture. Is it a B or is it a 3? It's easy for humans, even little humans, but it's impossible to just tell a bot in bot language how to do it because really we just know that's a B and that's a 3. We can say in words what makes them different, but bots don't understand words, and it's the wiring in our brains that makes it happen anyway. While an individual neuron may be understood and clusters of neurons' general purpose vaguely grasped, the whole is beyond. Nonetheless, it works. So to get a bot that can do this sorting, you don't build it yourself. You build a bot that builds bots and a bot that teaches bots. These bots' brains are simpler, something a smart human programmer can make. The builder bot builds bots, though it's not very good at it. At first, it connects the wires and modules in the bot brains almost at random. This leads to some very special student bots sent to TeacherBot to teach. Of course, TeacherBot can't tell a B from a 3 either. If the human could build TeacherBot to do that, well then, problem solved. Instead, the human gives TeacherBot a bunch of B photos and 3 photos and an answer key to which is what. TeacherBot can't teach, but TeacherBot can test. The adorkable student bots stick out their tongues, try very hard, but they are bad at what they do. Very, very bad. And it's not their fault really. They were built that way. Grades in hand, the student bots take a march of shame back to BuilderBot. Those that did best are put to one side, the others recycled. BuilderBot still isn't good at building bots, but now it takes those left and makes copies with changes and new combinations. Back to school they go. TeacherBot teaches, tests again, and BuilderBot builds again. And again, and again. Now, a builder that builds at random and a teacher that doesn't teach, just tests, and students who can't learn, they just are what they are, in theory shouldn't work, but in practice it does. Partly because in every iteration, BuilderBot's slaughterhouse keeps the best and discards the rest, and partly because TeacherBot isn't overseeing an old-timey one-room schoolhouse with a dozen students, but an infinite warehouse with thousands of students. The test
Just want to hammer home this point really quickly. Like, this is the crazy thing about the capacity for AI to test itself, to build on itself, and to iterate on itself, right? It has millions and millions of cycles to try a whole bunch of random shit, and quite often actually lands on something that works. And that, again, is sort of part of the nature of why we don't understand how it does it, because it, for lack of a better word, just stumbles across it.
test isn't 10 questions, but a million questions. And how many times does the test, build, test, loop, repeat? As many as necessary. At first, students that survive are just lucky, but by combining enough lucky bots and keeping only what works, and randomly messing around with new copies of that, eventually a student bot emerges that isn't lucky, that can perhaps barely tell B's from 3's. As this bot is copied and changed, slowly the average test score rises, and thus the grade needed to survive the next round gets higher and higher. Keep this up, and eventually from the infinite warehouse slaughterhouse, a student bot will emerge who can tell a B from a 3 in a photo it's never seen before pretty well. But how the student bot does this, neither the teacher bot, nor the builder bot, nor the human overseer can understand.
Crazy. Like, this is by far, again, I just love hammering home this point, is that we have no idea how the algorithm or how the AI works. We just know that it's capable of executing the task that BuilderBot and TeacherBot have essentially raised it to do. It's terrifying.
Nor the student bot itself. After keeping so many useful random changes, the wiring in its head is incredibly complicated, and while an individual line of code may be understood and clusters of code's general purpose vaguely grasped, the whole is beyond. Nonetheless, it works. But this is frustrating, especially as the student bot is very good at exactly only the kinds of questions it's been taught to. It's great with photos, but useless with videos, or baffled if the photos are upside down, or things that are obviously not B's, it's confident are. Since TeacherBot can't teach, all the human overseer can do is give it more questions to make the test even longer, to include the kinds of questions the best bot.
So just before it gets into this point, this is where some of the most interesting outsourcing of human labor that no one knows about or very few people pay attention to, that's happening on the internet. Often, there was a guy, I can't remember his name, but if you've ever used a CAPTCHA code online, you can thank this gentleman who invented the concept. So when he first started, or when he first started using CAPTCHA codes, right? What you had on one side was some text, usually with a line through it, and you could pretty easily read it, right? And then you would have another piece of text which almost always looked like it was out of a book. It looked like something like a photograph or a scan out of a book. And it put these two pieces of information and said, hey, give me the answer to these two things, the number with the line through it, and then whatever the book says. And the idea was is that this guy used the internet to ingest tons of books. So they would use what's called OCR software, optical character recognition. They would scan books into a library system or a database. And whatever the OCR couldn't pick up or says, I don't know what this says, I don't know what this number is, it would then farm out to CAPTCHA codes. And what you'd have happen is you'd have 10 people. So it has the answer that it knows, which is the weird squiggly line, obfuscated text. And then you have the picture from the scan. And if 10 people all say that says 302, right? Then all of a sudden it goes back to the thing. It's like, yo, that's 302. And now all of a sudden it's able to properly enter that into the catalog or properly recognize those optical characters. So capture codes were used to do things like translate the internet, a whole bunch of functions. A lot, you started seeing addresses, and that was to pinpoint, not just to identify addresses of houses, but to teach the AI in those Google cars to read that shit, right? And so we're going to go a little bit deeper down the rabbit hole.
Bots get wrong. This is important to understand. It's a reason why companies are obsessed with collecting data. More data equals longer tests equals better bots. So when you get the "Are you human?" test on a website, you are not only proving that you are human, hopefully, but you are also helping to build the test to make bots that can read or count or tell lakes from mountains or horses from humans. Seeing lots of questions about driving lately? What could that be building a test for? Now, figuring out what's in a photo or on a sign or filtering videos requires humans to make correct enough tests, but there is another kind of test that makes itself. Tests on the humans. For example, say entirely hypothetical NetMeTube wanted users to keep watching as long as possible. Well, how long a user stays on the site is easy to measure, so TeacherBot gives each student bot a bunch of NetMeTube users to oversee. The student bots watch what their user watches, looks at their files, and do their best to pick the videos that keep the user on the site. The longer the average, the higher their test score. Build, test, repeat. A million cycles later, there's a student bot who's pretty good at keeping the users watching, at least compared to what a human could build. But when people ask, how does the NetMeTube algorithm select videos, once again, there isn't a great answer other than pointing to the bot and the user data it had access to, and most vitally, how the human overseers direct TeacherBot to score the test. That's what the bot is trying to be good at to survive, but what the bot is thinking, or how it thinks it, is not really knowable. All that's knowable is this student bot gets to be the algorithm because it's 0.1% better than the previous bot at the test the humans designed. So everywhere on the internet, behind the scenes, there are tests to increase user interaction, or set prices just right to maximize revenue, or pick the posts from all your friends you'll like the most, or articles people will share the most, or whatever. If it's testable, it's teachable. Well, teachable. And a student bot will graduate from the warehouse to be the algorithm of its domain, at least for a little while. We're used to the idea that the tools we use, even if we don't understand them, someone does. But with our machines that learn, we are increasingly in a position where we use tools or are used by tools that no one, not even their creators, understand. We can only hope to guide them with the tests we make. And we need to get comfortable with that, as our algorithmic bot buddies are all around and not going anywhere. Okay, the bots are watching. You know what's coming.
Sorry, he's gonna do the whole like and subscribe thing. Anyway, please check out CGP Grey. I'm gonna put this YouTube video in the chat for anyone who's watching and wants to check it out and watch it again. I cannot recommend his content enough, particularly on this subject. He has another great video called "Humans Need Not Apply." It's 15 minutes long. I don't think we're gonna watch that tonight because I've got another one planned down the rabbit hole here. So, all right, cool. We've looked a little bit at artificial intelligence, and we've talked about how it's essentially built or programmed through more AI. It uses large data sets that we're constantly feeding it and reinforcing back into the system. But a lot of that AI, again, is like very narrow purpose, narrow scoped. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this particular development in AI is the AlphaFold system, and more specifically AlphaFold 2. So I'm going to read a little bit into the Wikipedia. We're going to look at what the actual like solution looks like and what the implications are, and then we're going to watch a little video. One of my favorite YouTubers, Lex Friedman, who does a very good synopsis of what this problem is, how AlphaFold works, and he'll do a much better job than me. And I figure I would just share that with you guys and add some commentary. So the 2020 version of the program AlphaFold is significantly different from the original version that won CAPS 13 in 2018, according to the team at DeepMind. DeepMind team had identified that its previous approach, combining local physics with a guide potential delivered from pattern recognition, had a tendency to overaccount for interactions between residues that were nearby in the sequence compared to interactions between residues further apart on the chain. As a result, AlphaFold 1 had a tendency to prefer models with lighter, blah, blah. Okay, so we're getting a little bit into the weeds here, and I'm going to avoid this. But essentially, they really made a huge change to their approach in how they were computing or coming up with the answer that they were looking for. And Lex gets in this a little bit, but it's more specifically they used an attention mechanism as opposed to a convolutable network or something else. And essentially what attention mechanisms do is they sort of allow the AI to refocus on a particular solution set or a particular way of looking at the problem based off of a probability of whether or not it's going to be able to get the right answer. So we talked a little bit about proteins. AlphaFold was set out to basically try and show or simulate the process of protein folding so that we can better understand how this process works. The reason for that is there's a huge number of implications. I'll let Lex get into those a little bit later. But the fact that, or the idea of us being able to understand the way that those amino acids are translating these 3D structures would allow us the potential to correct certain conditions, because there are certain conditions that are straight up you're just like not synthesizing a protein properly, or you're synthesizing too much of one. There's all kinds of medical implications if we could understand this process and potentially manipulate it. And again, when we got back to X-ray crystallography and all of these other fluorescent microscopy, those methods are extremely laborious, extremely cash intensive to get any headway with. If we could potentially simulate these protein folds in different experiments, it would change the game in terms of our ability to reduce the amount of time to solve certain problems. Okay. And again, the protein fold problem is, I think, like 50 years old. Like when we discovered them, we're just like, okay, we don't know how this works. And there really hasn't been a lot of good postulations or a lot of good simulations that have been able to say this is how it happens on the atomic level, essentially. So what does the solution look like? We're talking about, okay, you keep saying that it solved the problem, it solved the problem, it solved the problem. There's a wonderful visual representation of what it did, and I'll show it to you right here. So you have essentially two different proteins here. In green is your experimental result. So when we talked about X-ray crystallography, they mapped out these proteins using that technique. They mapped out the structure. Cool. We know what it looks like. In blue, you'll see what is the computational prediction of how that protein would have folded and what it would look like. So based off of real-world physics and the understanding of those particular molecules and how they interact with each other, it was essentially able to figure out the process, and you can see like the physical alignment of the proteins, right? You're like, okay, so again, blue is the prediction, green is the sort of the visual experimental result. There's a tiny amount of deviation for sure, like you can see it in certain little coils and stuff, but there's a tremendous amount of matching. And the implications of us being able to unlock the process of protein folding are insane. And that brings me to my last little video here that I wanted to play. This is one of my favorite YouTubers, Lex Friedman. Gives a really concise description of the entire process here, much better than I would do. I might throw some commentary on there, but let's dive right into that, okay?
Say that this year, 2020, has thrown quite a few challenges at human civilization. So it's really nice to get some positive news about truly marvelous accomplishments of engineering and science. One was SpaceX, I would argue, launching a new era of space exploration. And now, a couple of days ago, DeepMind has announced that its second iteration of the AlphaFold system has quote unquote solved the 50-year-old grand challenge problem of protein folding. Solved here means that these computational methods were able to achieve prediction performance similar to much slower, much more expensive experimental methods like X ray crystallography.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
In 2018, which is the previous iteration of the CASP competition, AlphaFold achieved a score of 58 on the hardest class of proteins. And this year, it achieved a score of 87, which is a huge improvement.
So sorry, I just want to stop here. This is something that like we're seeing a lot of in artificial intelligence right now are these insane hockey stick curves of innovation and improvement in performance. You know, we tweak something, we change a methodology, and all of a sudden we're like, whoa, it's just like fucking like that's a very, very large percentage to grasp over a couple of years. So
And it's still 26 points better than the closest competition. So this is definitely a big leap. But it's also fair to say that the internet is full of hype about this breakthrough. So let me indulge in the fun a bit. Some of it is definitely a little bit subjective, but I think the case could be made on the life science side that this is the biggest advancements in structural biology of the past 1 or 2 decades. And in my field of artificial intelligence, I think a strong case could be made that this is one of the biggest advancements in recent history of the field. So, of course, the competition is pretty steep, and I talk with excitement about each of these entries. Of course, the ImageNet moment itself, or the AlexNet moment that launched the deep learning revolution in the space of computer vision. So many people are comparing now this breakthrough of AlphaFold 2 to the ImageNet moment, but now in the life sciences field. I think the good old argument over beers about which is the biggest breakthrough comes down to the importance you place on how much real world direct impact a breakthrough has. Of course, AlexNet was ultimately on a toy data set of very simplistic image classification problem.
he makes an absolutely phenomenal point that I actually just want to reiterate really quickly that like stuff that's going on in AI is really cool, but the practical implications and the problems that it solves is going to actually generate the real excitement and the real investment in that technology. That's why people are kind of excited about this because there is a huge potential to leverage this in the future to understand. And again, it's not even just the biological side of it. He talks a little bit as well about our ability to synthesize new polymers, new material sciences, even artificial life. Looking into things like, okay, how can we do silicon based life form if we can change the structure of proteins potentially? So there's some crazy shit there. Another point that Lex makes here that's really good as well is that a lot of these things like AlexNet and AlphaZero, these things are usually executed on, though they are large, they are limited sets of data, right? So it's kind of like setting up a mouse to do a maze, that it's done mazes that sort of look like that before, as opposed to just letting it out into the wild and having no fucking idea where to go, because this is just a completely different experience. So I'll let Lex continue.
Which does not have a direct application to the real world, but it did demonstrate the ability of deep neural networks to learn from a large amount of data in a supervised way. But anyway, this is probably a very long conversation over many beers of
It
AlphaZero
would
with
kill to have
reinforcement
a
learning and
beer with
self
Lex
play.
Friedman to talk about this. I'm
Obviously, in
not gonna lie.
contention for the biggest breakthrough, the recent breakthroughs in the application of transformers in the natural language processing space, with GPT-3 being the most kind of recent iteration of state of the art performance. The actual deployment of robots in the field used by real humans, which is Tesla Autopilot, you know, deployment of massive fleet learning, of massive machine learning in safety critical systems. And then other kinds of robots like the Google self-driving car, Waymo systems that are taking even a further leap of removing the human from the picture, being able to drive the car autonomously without human supervision. smart speakers in the home. There's a lot of actual in the wild natural language processing that I think doesn't get enough credit from the artificial intelligence community, how much amazing stuff is there. And depending how much value you put in engineering achievements, especially in the hardware space, Boston Dynamics with Spot Mini Spot robot is just one could argue is one of the great accomplishments in the artificial intelligence field, especially when you maybe look 20 and 50 years down the line when the entire world is populated by robot dogs and the humans have gone extinct.
I don't necessarily subscribe to Lex's. I think he's being a little hyperbolic and cheeky here. But one thing that I really want to point out, and Lex at MIT actually they build an AI driven car. But one of the interesting things that he has built into the sensor system that I don't think Tesla necessarily has is he's built sensors to sort of detect what the human being is up to. So I think when people think about AI and self-driving cars, they think that it's going to drive the car for you. I think you're going to see a lot less of that. And what you're actually going to see is a lot more AI augmentation. So what AI is going to do is it's going to stop you from getting into an accident. It's going to stop you from turning into the wrong place or hitting another car, or it's going to do collision avoidance if something avoidance, Sheboygan avoidance. Sorry. And so, what it's going to do is it's going to enhance our ability to execute on certain tasks. It's going to do a lot of complementing. I don't necessarily think that you're going to actually see like a full scale stealing of, AI taking over a lot of things. But I do see it being extremely, just really permeating our everyday routines. Like, think about what it would be like to have a series. It's kind of like that movie with Joaquin Phoenix, Her, I think it's called, where the AI. That's kind of where we're going. That's a very very accurate picture, I think, of where we're going with AI.
Anyway, I say all that for fun, but really, this is one of the big breakthroughs in our field and something to truly be excited about. And I'll talk about some of the possible future impact I see here from this breakthrough in just a couple of slides here. Anyway, my prediction is that there will be at least one, potentially several Nobel Prizes that will result in derivative work launched directly with these computational methods. It's kind of exciting to think that it's possible also that we'll see a first Nobel Prize that is awarded where much of the work is done by a machine learning system. Of course, the Nobel Prize is awarded to the humans behind the system, but it's exciting to think that a computational approach or machine learning system will play a big role in a Nobel Prize level discovery in the field like medicine.
Chat, big question for chat. Do you guys think in the next 50 years that we might see a Nobel Prize go to an AI? Like, imagine we built an artificial intelligence that actually solved like a huge problem. Like, oh shit, like we don't need guns no more, or like war's over, guys. Would do you think people would Nobel that AI up? I don't think we'd be that far off for that. I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years, but always curious to see what people think.
Medicine and physiology or chemistry or even physics. Okay, let's talk a bit about proteins and protein folding, why this whole space is really fascinating. First of all, there's amino acids, which are the basic building blocks of life in eukaryotes, which is what we're talking about here with humans. There's 21 of them. Proteins are chains of amino acids and are the workhorses of living organisms, of cells. And they do all kinds of stuff from structural to functional. They serve as catalysts for chemical reactions. They move stuff around. They do all kinds of things. So they're both the building blocks of life and the doers and movers of life. Hopefully, I'm not being too poetic. So protein folding is the fascinating process of going from the amino acid sequence to a 3D structure. There's a lot that could be said here. There's a lot of lectures on this topic, but let me quickly say some of the more fascinating and important things that I remember from a few biology classes I took in high school and college. Okay. So first is there's a fascinating property of uniqueness that a particular sequence usually maps one-to-one to a 3D structure. Not always, but usually. To me, from an outsider's perspective, that's just weird and fascinating. The other thing to say is that the 3D structure determines the function of the protein. So one of the correlators of that is that the underlying cause of many diseases is the misfolding of proteins.
So just to touch on the really exciting aspect of this, like imagine the breakthrough from this technology as now we are able to identify how proteins misfold and stop that process, or we're able to inject some kind of counter protein that allows that misfolding to fold properly. The amount of diseases that you could sort of wipe off the map, again, we're talking like decades of development here and a lot of optimism, but that's why stuff like this is just so exciting. And I don't think there's enough people who are like getting excited about the really positive impacts that things like artificial intelligence and computing are bringing to the table right now. So I'll let him keep diving in here.
Now back to the weirdness of the uniqueness of the folding. There's a lot of ways for a protein to fold based
This
on
is
the
crazy.
sequence of the amino acids. There's, I think, 10 to the power of 80 atoms in the universe. So 10 to the power of 143 is a lot. And you can look at Leventhal's
That is
paradox,
an
which is one of the
understatement.
early formulations of just how hard this problem is and why it's really weird that a protein is able to do it so quickly. As a completely irrelevant side note, I wonder how many possible chess games there are. I think I remember it being 10 to the power of 100, something like that. I think that would also necessitate removing certain kinds of infinite games. Anyway, off the top of my head, I would venture to say that the
Lex is
protein
such a
folding
chess
problem,
nerd. I love
just
him.
in the number of possible combinations, is much, much harder than the game of chess. But it's also much weirder. You know, they say that life imitates chess, but I think that from a biological perspective, life is way weirder than chess. Anyway, to say once again what
Well
I said
put.
before
Ever
is
the
that the
poet. I love this
misfolding of
dude.
proteins is the underlying cause of many diseases. And again, I'll talk about the implications of that a little bit later. From a computational, from a machine learning, from a data set perspective, what we're looking at currently is 200 million proteins that have been mapped and 170,000 protein 3D structures, so much, much fewer. And that's our training data for the learning-based approaches for the protein folding problem. Now, the way those
So again, just like think about the disparity there. Like we have about 200 million proteins that we know about, and we've identified the 3D structure of about 170,000 of them. So it's getting back to our ability for things like AlphaFold 2 to completely accelerate our understanding of how these things work and our ability to manipulate them and have positive benefits. Absolutely insane.
3D structures were determined is through experimental methods, one of the most accurate being X-ray crystallography, which I saw a University of Toronto study showing that it costs about $120,000 per protein. It takes about 1 year to determine the 3D structure. So because it costs a lot and it's very slow, that's why you only have 170,000 3D structures determined. Now, that's one of the big things that the AlphaFold 2 system might be able to provide is, at least for a large class of proteins, be able to determine the 3D structure with a high accuracy, enough to be able to sort of open up the structural biology field entirely with sort of several orders of magnitude more protein 3D structures to play with. There's not currently a paper out that describes the details of the AlphaFold 2 system, but I think it's clear that it's heavily based on the AlphaFold 1 system.
So I'm just going to pause here. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here. The AlphaFold 1, AlphaFold 2 are very technical from an AI perspective. A lot of the jargon I even get lost in. Another interesting point that Lex makes when he talks about AlphaFold 2 is we don't actually know how it works because they haven't told us. Back to the CPG Grey video, a lot of these organizations, this is IP. This is intellectual property to them. They do not want it to be public knowledge. They spend an enormous amount of time, money, and resources in developing these technologies, and it's not something that they're always willing to show all their cards in. I think we have a little bit of a better understanding of how AlphaFold 1 worked. And again, this is something that hit about, what, like 53%, prediction or whatever, and then you have the other one that hit 83. So we're, again, we're basically going to skip through this. I'll let him touch quickly on, I'll let him get lost in the jargon, and then you guys can understand why I'm going to skip ahead here.
Now, how does AlphaFold 2 work? First of all, we don't know for sure. There's only a blog post and some little speculation here and there. But one thing is clear, that there's attentional mechanisms. So I think convolutional neural networks are out and transformers are in. The same kind of process that's been happening in the natural language processing space and really most of the deep learning space. It's clear that attention mechanisms are going to be taking over every aspects of machine learning. So I think the big change is ComNet is out, transformers are in. The rest is more in the speculation space. It does seem that the MSA, the multiple
Okay,
sequence.
we're gonna skip through this because
I don't know if there's.
I don't think I'm not even a competent AI scientist to understand or interpolate any of this or give you guys an opinion on it. So we're gonna skip ahead to why this breakthrough is important.
Computer scientist, AI person to wax poetic about some biology for a bit. So because the protein structure gives us the protein function, figuring out the structure for maybe millions of proteins might allow us to learn unknown functions of genes encoded in DNA. Also, as I mentioned before, it might allow us to understand the cause of many diseases that are the result of misfolded proteins. Other applications will stem from the ability to quickly design new proteins that in some way alter the function of other proteins. So for treatments, for drugs, that means designing proteins that fix other misfolded proteins. Again, those are the causes of many diseases. I read a paper that was talking about agriculture applications of being able to engineer insecticidal proteins or frost protective coating, stuff I know nothing about. I read it, it's out there. Tissue regeneration through self-assembling proteins.
This is crazy.
Supplements for improved
Growing
health
back
and
arms
anti-aging,
and shit, guys.
and all kinds of biomaterials for textiles and just materials in general. Now, in the long term or the super long term future impact of this breakthrough might be just the advancement of end-to-end learning of really complicated problems in the life sciences.
Yeah, so I want to touch on this really quickly, and he makes a really good point, and he even said this when he was addressing the idea of this potential. He's like, this is not necessarily going to get a Nobel Prize, but work that is derivative of what this is able to produce will. And so this is essentially a very small but also sort of monumental step in saying, like, holy shit, like, we pointed this at a thing that we've never been able to understand before. It solved it very quickly. Now we can use those computational methodologies to point at different problems, fine tune the scope. Again, we're not nearly at a point where we're ever going to get AGI. And at the end of this video, when we kind of wrapped up, I'm going to read a really interesting passage from a book that I think will get people stoked on the potential future of this stuff. But yeah, just this is a stepping stone for us to take things to the next level, and that's why it's, again, like, it's incredibly exciting. We solved this problem, but I don't want people to be short-sighted. This is really just like a small cog in a much bigger system coming down the road.
So protein folding is looking at the folding of a single protein. So being able to predict multi-protein interaction or protein complex formation, which even in my limited knowledge of biology, I think is a much harder problem as far as I understand. And just being able to incorporate the environment into the modeling of the folding of the protein, and also seeing how the function of that protein might change given the environment. All those kinds of things, incorporating that into the end-to-end learning problem. Then taking a step even further is physics, biophysics. So being able to accurately do physics-based simulation of biological systems. So if we think of a protein as one of the most basic biological systems, so then taking a step out farther and further and increasing the complexity of the biological systems, you can start to think of something crazy like being able to do accurate physics-based simulation of cells, for example, or entire organs. Or maybe one day being able to do an accurate physics-based simulation of the very over-caffeinated organ that's producing this very video. In fact, how do we know?
So again, I just want to touch on, like, something that he mentions is just the ability to leverage this for predictions with physics. Like, I've watched a lot of interesting videos on things like string theory and stuff like that. And there's some scientists who are like, string theory's dead. That science is going nowhere. We have no idea what the fuck is going on. This is the type of thing that like we will be able to use AI to make predictions about crazy problems that we don't understand. One of the issues that we are having is in computation is as we make processors smaller and smaller and those little tiny transistors tinier and tinier, it gets to they're essentially just logic gates. It's just open, close, open, close, open, close. And when it's open, it lets electrons through. And when it's closed, the electrons stop. 1 0 1 0, right? And what happens at a certain distance, like when you make that channel a certain number of microns or a certain number of atoms small, you all of a sudden encounter quantum tunneling. And this is where the electrons, they just pop through the gate, literally end up on the other side of the gate. We don't know why it happens. It's just like poop. It's like, so when as we compress transistors smaller and smaller, our ability to control electrical flow disappears. And this is why you hear about quantum computing. Quantum computing is the solution to that problem. It's actually using those tiny little quanta to make calculations or to create, a 1 0 and a third sort of state of matter. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, again, this is the type of physics-based simulation that could help us with those breakthroughs and really solve a lot of the problems. Because like quantum computing right now, I don't want to say it's bullshit, like it's completely feasible, but there's like, you're not going to see a quantum computer in your house in the next 50 years. Probably just like hard truth. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm probably not based off of what I've read. So anyway,
This is not
more breakthroughs,
a
guys.
physics-based simulation of a biological system whose assigned name happens to be Lex. I guess we'll never know. And of course, we can go farther out into super long-term sci-fi kind of ideas of biological life and artificial life, which are fascinating ideas of being able to play with simulation of prediction of organisms that are biologically based or non-biologically based. I mean, that's the exciting future of end-to-end learning systems that step outside the game-playing world of StarCraft, of chess and Go into the life sciences of real-world systems that operate in the real world. That's where Tesla Autopilot is really exciting. That's where any robots that use machine learning are really exciting. And that's where this big breakthrough in the space of structural biology is super exciting. And truly, to me, as one humble human, inspiring beyond words. Speaking of words, for me, these quick videos are fun.
Okay, so before he goes into sponsors, I'm going to cut him off. But I just want to say this is one of the reasons why, like, I really love Lex Friedman. Like, he's such an interesting scientist, thinker, but he's also just like so posy. It's awesome. I think more people really need to get into his content. Self-driving. So the one thing I just wanted to show really quickly was playing guitar in a self-driving car. So he built these sensors in the car to essentially tell, like, is he holding a guitar? Is he playing the guitar? Is he potentially drinking water, or is he holding his phone? So imagine your car being set up to interpolate what you're doing and being able to take over for you. It's like, you're not paying attention, dude. Like, you don't see that car coming. You're going to get brake checked. So I'm just going to show you what this actually looks like
Would
in
you like
real
to
time.
play along?
Yes.
Ready?
Yes.
So clearly, it's like, it's a 90% chance that this guy's playing the fucking guitar right now. It's definitely holding the guitar. And then as he cycles through like different activities, it's like, it looks like, oh, he's definitely drinking water and soda right now. Right? Or if he ends up holding his phone, there's also going to be able to pick on that. So this is where you're going to see interesting narrow scoped AIs that will augment certain things that, like, maybe you're not paying attention to, and you should. Lex Friedman, again, can't recommend his stuff enough. He's an absolutely brilliant scientist, podcaster, just an overall like super cool dude. Before I end tonight's stream, because I think I'm approaching the end of kind of what I wanted to chat about, and for those of you who've come and stuck around and listened to me rant, I really appreciate it. It means a lot to me, and I really have fun talking about this kind of stuff. So I'm going to start doing it a little bit more frequently, and I hope you come back for more. This book is called Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It's written by Max Tegmark, who is a physicist and I believe a mathematician, and also I think has made contributions to the AI sciences, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to read a fairly short passage out of the beginning of the book. A little bit of context. I'm jumping in the middle here, but we're talking about this group called the Omegas. And the Omegas are a conglomerate of scientists who have built an incredibly powerful, what I was talking about way earlier, which is an AGI, an artificial general intelligence. Okay. And they have been using this AGI to essentially produce cartoons, because they're like, okay, if we feed a lot of cartoons, maybe it'll make funny cartoons. It gets really good at doing it. So the Omegas are using Prometheus to do a bunch of stuff. And we're kind of jumping in the middle here, but over a time scale of months, the business empire controlled by the Omegas started gaining a foothold in ever more areas of the world economy, thanks to superhuman planning by Prometheus. By carefully analyzing the world's data, it already, during its first week, presented the Omegas with a detailed step-by-step growth plan, and it kept improving and refining this plan and its data and as the data and computer resources grew. Although Prometheus was far from omniscient, its capabilities were now so far beyond humans that the Omegas viewed it as the perfect oracle, dutifully providing brilliant answers and advice in response to all of their questions. Prometheus software was now highly optimized to make the most of rather mediocre human-invented hardware that it ran on. And as the Omegas had anticipated, Prometheus identified ways of dramatically improving this hardware. Fearing a breakout, they refused to build robotic construction facilities that Prometheus could control directly. Instead, they hired large numbers of world-class scientists and engineers in multiple locations and fed them internal research reports written by Prometheus, pretending that they were from other research sites. These reports detailed novel physical effects and manufacturing techniques that the engineer soon tested, understood, and mastered. Normal human research and development, R&D, cycles, of course, take years, in large part because they involve many slow cycles of trial and error. The current situation was very different. Prometheus already had this next steps figured out. So the limiting factor was simply how rapid people could be guided to understand and build the right things. A good teacher can help students learn science much faster than they could have discovered it from scratch on their own. And Prometheus surreptitiously did the same with these researchers. Since Prometheus could accurately predict how long it would take humans to understand and build things, given various tools, it developed the quickest possible path forward, giving priority to the new tools that could be quickly understood and built and that were useful for developing more advanced tools. In the spirit of the maker movement, the engineering teams were encouraged to use their own machines to build better machines. This self-sufficiency not only saved money, but also made them less vulnerable to future threats from the outside world. Within 2 years, they were producing much better computer hardware than the world had ever known, and to avoid helping outside competition, they kept this technology under wraps and only used it to upgrade Prometheus. What the world did notice, however, was an astonishing tech boom. Upstart companies around the world were launching revolutionary new products in almost all areas. A South Korean startup launched a new battery that stored twice as much energy in your laptop in half the mass and could be charged in under a minute. A Finnish firm released a cheap solar panel with twice the efficiency of its best competitors. A German company announced a new type of mass-producible wire that was superconducting at room temperature, revolutionizing the energy sector. A Boston-based biotech group announced a phase 2 clinical trial for what they claim was the first effective, side effect-free weight loss drug, while rumors suggested that an Indian outfit was already selling similar on the black market. A California company countered with the phase 2 trial of a blockbuster cancer drug, which caused the body's immune system to identify and attack cells with any of the most common cancerous mutations. Examples just kept coming, triggering talk of a new golden age for science. Last but not least, robotics companies were cropping up like mushrooms all over the world. None of the bots came close to matching human intelligence, and most of them looked nothing like humans. But they dramatically disrupted the economy, and over years to come, they gradually replaced more of the workers in manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, retail, construction, mining, agriculture, forestry, and fishing. What the world didn't notice, thanks to the hard work of the crack team of lawyers, was that all of these firms were controlled through a series of intermediaries by the Omegas. Prometheus was flooding the world's patent offices with sensational inventions via various proxies, and these inventions gradually led to domination in all areas of technology. Although these disruptive new companies made powerful enemies among their competition, they made even more powerful friends. They were exceptionally profitable. And under slogans such as investing in our community, they spent a significant fraction of these profits hiring people for community projects. Often the same people who'd been laid off from these companies that were disrupted. They used detailed Prometheus-produced analysis identifying jobs that would be maximally rewarding for the employees and the community for the least cost. Tailored to the local circumstances. In regions with high levels of government service, this often focused on community building, culture, caregiving, while in poorer regions, it also introduced launching and maintaining schools, healthcare, daycare, elder care, affordable housing, parks, and basic infrastructure. Pretty much everywhere, locals agreed that these were things that should have been done a long time ago. Local politicians got generous donations, and care was taken to make them look good for encouraging these corporate community investments. Guys, can't recommend this book enough. It is absolutely dope. That is the first chapter, and it just gets you so amped for like, okay, when's all this coming, dude? Like, when is the world gonna be, when is the AI gonna save us all? Where is Prometheus? On that note, I am going to end it. It was a fun, super fun stream. Love to get feedback from friends if you guys found this enjoyable. If you guys want to hear about new topics, if there's things you're curious about, I'd love to hear from you. I'm always compiling new fun stuff that I want to talk about and put together in subjects. And this is a good time to peace out because my cat's making a bunch of noise. Guys, I love you all. Peace. Have a good one.